Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're watching us from, and welcome to Writers Unplugged. This is a series that will air as a chance to hear your favorite writers or new to you writers in conversation as if you were eavesdropping on them in a coffee shop. My name is Jen Jumba, and I'm a librarian at the main branch of Cleveland Public Library. One of my favorite things to do besides reading is talking to writers. It's an opportunity to get to know their craft, what inspires their stories, where they like to write, essentially getting to know them better and see them as human beings and not just the name on the spine of a book. And we are so lucky to have Samuel Burr joining us from London to talk about his debut novel, The Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. To find out who else is visiting Writers Unplugged, both virtually and in person, visit cpl.org/unplugged. And Maxbacks Books on Coventry is our fabulous independent bookstore, and they have copies of Samuel's books for you. So, brief introduction to Samuel Burr. Samuel Burr studied at the Westminster Film School and now works as an author and freelance TV executive. He has developed and produced popular factual shows, including Channel 4's Genderquake and The Greatest Shows on Earth, BBC 2's 8 Go Rallying and The Secret Life of Cleaners, and the BAFTA-nominated Secret Life of 4-Year-Olds. A documentary he shot inside a retirement village when he was merely 18 years old launched his career in television and inspired this debut novel, The Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. Samuel's writing has been shortlisted for Penguin's Right Now scheme, and in 2021, he graduated from the Faber Academy, which since 1929, so almost 100 years, has helped writers to find their voice. In his spare time, Samuel volunteers for the elderly charity Age UK, lives in London with his partner Tom and their cat Muriel. So I met Sam last December when I was moderating a panel for librarians. It was all about books publishing in the spring, and the panel was titled Book Club Best Bets. And when you're lucky enough to read ahead, and then you have books that are so discussable, it is not only hard to contain all the questions, but there are few people you can talk about the book with. Thankfully, and congratulations to Samuel, since The Fellowship of Puzzlemakers just published on Tuesday, and now I can talk about it with all of you and with Samuel today. And as a funny aside, I bought the book on Tuesday evening because I wanted a hard copy. And I was walking through the shopping area, popped into a couple of stores. Everywhere I went, people were asking, "What are you reading?" I immediately talked about it. They wrote it down. They took pictures with their phone, including the gentleman working at the bookstore. So please join me in a warm welcome to Samuel Burr.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah. So this is your debut novel, The Fellowship of Puzzlemakers, just published 2 days ago, so days old. Can you tell us and give us a brief introduction to this book?
Yes, I can. I mean, this is a book about a young man called Clayton Stumper. Clayton I describe him as a young man who's sort of grown old before he's grown up.
Yes.
He sort of dresses like your granddad and drinks sherry like your aunt. Young fogey like myself, and at 25 years of age finds himself as one of the last surviving members of this very British institution, which is the Fellowship. It's a sort of community of some of the most brilliant, smartest minds in the country, and among them we've got a maze maker, quiz setter, jigsaw artist, quiz compiler, just to name just a few. But there's a mystery at the heart of the Fellowship and a sort of puzzle that's yet to be solved, and that is how Clayton came to live with all these brilliant minds. He was abandoned at birth on the front steps when he was a baby, and so when the founder of the Fellowship, an esteemed cruciverbalist who's a crossword compiler, Pippa, passes away, she bequeaths her final puzzle to Clayton, and that promises to reveal the mystery of his past. So in the novel we follow Clayton on a quest as he pieces together the clues and finds himself at the same time.
Yeah, no pun intended, right? With piecing together. Yeah.
Yes.
Well done. Well done. I even love his name, and the fact that his last name is Stumper, because he has essentially stumped all the people living in this manner.
He's the mystery they've never been able to solve.
Yes. And we all have one, I'm sure. Maybe some of us have more than one.
Right.
But one of the things I'm struck by is your inspiration for this book. We talked a little bit about it in the introduction that, when you were only 18, you did a documentary, and that kind of inspired this story that you know, we now hold in our hands today, at least in the States, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was a documentary I made. So I left school at sort of 16. I sort of had a slightly different route through education. I haven't got, I don't know how it works in America, but I haven't got A levels, which is the sort of what you get just before you go to university. I sort of left school and I went to college and did a sort of vocational course in media training, sort of media production. I was always obsessed with stories.
Yes.
I'm sort of one of those authors that perhaps whenever I hear an author being interviewed, they always say that they was, you know, they've always been a voracious reader. They've always, you know, they've been writing novels since they were 7 years old. I'm not that sort of person. And I've been sort of thinking about it. And actually, I think I've always loved telling stories.
Okay.
And I love television. So that was my first passion. And I got a place. I won a scholarship to go to Westminster Film School. And when I turned up in the first year, we had I think it was like a half-term sort of break. Basically, the university was closing down, and I decided I was going to borrow some of the camera equipment, a light, tripod, a camera, and me and my mate were going to go off to this retirement village that I'd heard about and just had been fascinated in. It was called Whiteley Retirement Village in Walton-on-Thames, and it was 100 years old. It was set up by a philanthropist who donated a huge sum of money back then to sort of set up this community for older people who couldn't afford to pay for their own care. So it had a really interesting sort of history and heritage. But the thing that I loved about it was that it felt like a sort of holiday camp. It was so, we went and it was just so exciting. We sort of did a bit of a recce and we turned up and there was a drama club and they were doing Grease. And there was dance classes and there was a pub, you know, all within the sort of confines of this community. So I love the sort of world within a world. And we ended up making a documentary, which, we ended up living, me and my friend Danny lived in the village as 18-year-olds, sort of guest suite. And what I thought of, one of the things I took from it, which I loved, was that every person that we met, every resident in the village, everyone had a great story. And I think that was one of the reasons, that's one of the moments where I realized that I loved spending time with older people because they've always got the best stories. You know, they've lived lives, they've got stories to tell. And so whenever we lifted the camera and pointed at any resident and sat them down and asked what their life had been like, we always got just absolute gems. So there was a lady that was sort of, I always remember in the back of every shot, wherever we were filming, church, we were going in the shop, we're everywhere. There was just a lady and she was in every shot and she was just looking at us. And on the final day, I said, "Is there any, could we do an interview with you?" And no, she said, I'm too shy. And I said, I just kept pushing. I was like, it'd be really nice. It's just a conversation, it's just, you can forget the camera's there. And then we ended up sitting down in the church together and she told me this just amazing story about being a nun and how she'd escaped the nunnery. And, it was just fascinating. So, we made the documentary. It went out and I think the thing that I took from it, one of the things I found funny was that by the time we'd finished the week at the retirement village, me and Danny, as 18-year-olds, were exhausted and we were desperate to get home because we were so tired because they had the busiest social lives. They were doing something every night. And we were both young fogies. We were just desperate to put our feet up and just go home and watch telly. Whereas, they were out every night doing something or other. And I loved that. I love the idea that we as young people are actually, at heart, we were sort of older than they were. The film went out and it got nominated for this, I think it was called a First Light BAFTA Award, which was great fun. And we were sort of, we had a red carpet event at Leicester Square in London. And
nice.
We didn't win, sadly, but it did sort of kickstart our careers in TV. And it's sort of been lingering in the back of my head for a long, long time that I knew I wanted to write about a community of older people with brilliant stories and secrets. And so, that was a huge, huge inspiration, I think, for me.
Absolutely. So I'm joined in conversation this afternoon or evening with Samuel Burr, Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. So I think it speaks to you and the fact that, you were just having a conversation that people felt comfortable sharing their stories with you. I mean, that's part of the equation, and then being able to kind of hold on to those stories and see it appear in a book. how has your career in terms of television and film influenced your writing? Because it's atmospheric. I mean, you can see the scenes unfold
Yeah.
as you're reading.
It's funny. It's not something I was conscious of until sort of afterwards, and people said things like, well, what you've just said, that is very visual. And I think the way that I always think about any idea in TV, my job was as a development producer, so I would devise new concepts and formats and documentaries and pitch them to broadcasters. And obviously, as part of that, I'm thinking about what we're looking at, what we're filming. Someone once said to me when I pitched an idea, when we lift the camera, what are we filming? Which is a really basic question, but actually
Right.
sort of and how great the idea is, but what are you actually watching? And I think that has sort of informed the way that I write. I sort of see things before I start writing them, and it's almost as if I am lifting a camera and sort of moving it around the house.
Yeah, I felt like I could walk through that house and know how to get to Pippa's room and how to get to where Clayton's room is, and then how to get to, the front,
Right.
Where he was left in a hat box. So, yeah.
No, I love that. Was some of my favorite, and I think, to be honest, the fact that I was writing a lot of it during lockdown. Me and my partner were obviously isolating, or we're in lockdown in a one-bed flat in London. And actually, a lot of my friends that are writers were really struggling to write during that time. Obviously, it was a really difficult time for everyone. But for me, the Creighton Hall, the headquarters of the fellowship, became my kind of escape. That was the place that I really loved going to. And it was a gift, really, that I could kind of switch off from the world and disappear into this sort of slight bubble. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I recommend it highly to everybody to escape, and then at the same time to learn. There's lessons woven throughout. But let's talk a little bit about the structure, because you have two different points of view and you have two different timelines. So can you talk a little bit about why you chose to structure the novel this way?
It was something that I decided on quite early on. I knew I started writing Clayton's timeline first.
Okay.
And very first scene that I ever wrote remains the first chapter in the book, which is the sort of, it's not a spoiler because it's literally the first chapter. It's the wake scene where Pippa, who's the founder of the fellowship, is in her open coffin, and all of the Puzzlemakers are standing around her. And there's a line from one of the Puzzlemakers saying, "If it wasn't for Pippa, none of us would be here." And I love the idea of starting a novel with an ending. And but I also knew that she was a character that I was really interested in, and I knew that I wanted to return to her. There was something quite nice about having a scene where you get a sense that obviously she's passed, and then you could jump back in time and you see her sort of in her heyday. You see her in the moments where she's sort of bringing together this group for the first time, and that's the point at which her life changes. There's a moment where in the scene immediately after we see her in the coffin, we see her at the pub in London where she's setting up the puzzle club for the very first time. She hitches up her tweed skirt and she makes her way up the stairs and into the next chapter of her life. And that for me was that was something that was quite conscious. I loved writing Pippa, and I knew that I wanted her to be a big part of the book. I also really am interested in the idea of how, as people, we go on journeys and we learn things that maybe our ancestors have learned. I love the idea that in Pippa's timeline, we're sort of seeing her make the mistakes that then she's helping Clayton learn.
Right.
And so that was something that I sort of technically was thinking about. I was trying to think about, okay, if we're seeing two people go on two journeys, how are they reflected in each other? And I really love those moments where I can occasionally, in the present tense timeline, sort of a hint to something in the past, or use the past tense timeline, sort of make something make sense or unlock a part of the story in the present tense. In a way that sort of feels satisfying. I think for a mystery novel, there's something really lovely about having two timelines where you can sort of slowly unravel the story. And so I had a great fun doing that. I had to sort of write in zones. I couldn't jump between the two characters. So I'd sort of have a month where I was in Pippa's head.
Okay. That was going to be my next question, is trying to anticipate how you switched back and forth, because so I'm joined in conversation with Samuel Burr, debut novel, 2 days old. You have to get it. it keeps you flipping the page because, you know, the chapter ends with Pippa and you're kind of on a cliffhanger, and then it goes to Clayton and then a cliffhanger. So then you go back to Pippa, and it's just this wonderful cadence that goes back and forth throughout the book. And many times I saw them making these like parallel journeys, you know, so to your point, the very lessons that Pippa's learning, you know, she's trying to teach Clayton as well. So, you know, I think about the life lessons, you know, that Pippa's trying to impart. And one of the things that I thought a lot about, because it's referenced several times, and I'm on a crew team, and we see this quote and we hear this quote all the time. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so that line repeats itself throughout the book. Can you talk about why it was important to you to talk about, you know, working together?
Well, I think in one of the early scenes, when Pippa's sort of gathering her Puzzlemakers in her puzzle club for the first time, I wanted to make it clear to the reader that, yes, on the surface, this is a book about puzzles and puzzle making, but ultimately, like all books, it's not really about that at all. It's about a community, and there's a bit of a line of dialogue in that scene where she's sort of asking people why they've come that night, why have they come to the pub, and one person says he's started to feel a bit lost, a bit alone in the world, and there is something about people potentially who find themselves sort of obsessed with puzzles that might find it hard to connect with other people. And I was interested in the idea of exploring that and using puzzles as a metaphor, not just to sort of find missing pieces in your life, but also make connections. You know, we're always in puzzles, you're always looking at finding a connection between A and B, but actually I like the idea of building human connections, and it became a big part of the club. In actual fact, I think there's a moment in one of the scenes where they sort of barely do any puzzle making at all. They're just having drinks and having a lovely time. It's someone's birthday and they're having a lovely get together. And so, yeah, that for me was really important. I love the idea that puzzles are something we all have a connection to, and puzzles bring people together, which I love. I love the fact it's one of those unifying things. And it's been amazing since the book has gone out and been published in America to sort of see how we've all got memories of puzzling, whether it's sort of playing with a shape sorter as a child, or doing jigsaws with our grandparents, or, you know, Wordle on the tube. It's something that sort of unites us all. And that was something I was really keen to explore, and to make it a book about community and about social isolation becomes a bit of a theme later on in the book. An idea, you know, the idea of people struggling with loneliness and using puzzles as a way to connect with other people.
Absolutely. Here in the United States, our Surgeon General has talked about the next epidemic being loneliness, right? And people struggling for human connection. So I do want to tell you that after reading this and growing up loving jigsaw puzzles, that tomorrow my department, so I'm in the popular department at Main Library, will have a community puzzle.
Oh, wow.
Just for people to gather. There are people that come in by themselves all the day to read the paper, or they come in to do some work, or come in to see what's new. But to have a puzzle just so that people can kind of collaborate together, it's special. So, and it comes as a nod. It was like, well, why wouldn't I do that in the library, right? You know, so I start telling my colleagues, and my colleagues are like, "Oh, I'm coming down on my break." I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely, that's fine." So,
yeah, great. I was so pleased to hear that.
Yeah. And so can you talk, so I'm enjoying the conversation to make sure I talk about your name and the title as much as I possibly can. Samuel Burr, Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. Can you talk a little bit about all the different types of puzzles, like how you became aware of them? I mean, I think jigsaw, crossword, Wordle, Sudoku, but then you just took it to a whole nother level with these characters, and maybe you can talk a little bit about them and their strength of puzzling, if that's even puzzle addicts. Is that like, I don't know what the
masters
puzzle
is the idea of because puzzles is quite a generic term actually, and when I was looking at the various forms of puzzle, something I kind of realized quite quickly, I like the idea that the characters, one of the big challenges in the book is sort of creating a book about a community or even a commune of people is a challenge because it means that you can't have just 3 or 4 characters. You have to have quite a few. And so
Right.
for me, one of the ways of being able to identify which character was which was giving them a specialism, giving them a sort of a thing that made them unique. And so for Pippa, her specialism is words. She, I think there's a line that's something about her as a child. She used to play with words as if they were putty. And there's another a former accountant who is very good with the numbers and does lots of the numerical puzzles. There's a man who's very handsome, who sort of a rugged guy who wears a nice jacket. And there was something just quite lovely about the idea of giving them all their own sort of special department. And actually at the front of the book, there's a sort of register of Puzzlemakers, so you can see what their specialisms are. Specialisms are. You can go back. So we've got the Master of Mazes, we've got Queen of Quizzes, we've got the Minister of Mechanical Puzzles. They all have their own little titles, and I felt like that was the sort of thing they would do. They'd sort of give themselves their own names. Prince of Pieces is the jigsaw guy.
And I think one of the things is it's just a parallel for life, right? We all are unique. We all have different skill sets, and yet we still are drawn to people who have a similar interest and a common interest, to kind of do more. I think Pippa says when she's assembling this group, like, amazing, like all these extraordinary minds in one place and what we can do. All these amazing minds, imagine what we could achieve together. It was another thing is that Pippa goes on her own sort of journey, as I said earlier, that she sort of learns her own lessons. And Pippa's a very feisty, strong-minded woman, and I loved writing her. But I needed her to have a moment of comeuppance. I needed her to have a moment of realization that actually she sort of needs to practice what she preaches. She's created this collective of brilliant minds, and she needs to learn to lean on certain people more and not try to do everything herself. Absolutely.
There's a moment without giving away anything too much. There's a moment where she has to step back and decide which person within the commune would be better suited to help on a very particular task. And then that's something that's not natural to her, but she assigns someone else a job.
I think in real life, there's some of us where that's true. It's hard for us to ask for help, and there are other people that it's no problem whatsoever. Right? We all know them.
Yeah, Clayton is someone, and that was one of the things that I sort of loved about Clayton, was that during the writing, it wasn't something I thought an awful lot about, but during the quest, I realized that he didn't have a huge amount of pride, and he wasn't. One of the things I love about Clayton is that he isn't a puzzle maker. He's the only one there that hasn't earned his place. He's not a genius. He doesn't think he's that bright even. And so when he's gifted this puzzle, he's quite intimidated by it because he doesn't think he's not sure he'll be able to do it. So what I love is that actually Clayton, and maybe this is what I tried to insinuate, was the idea that something that Pippa has passed on during her sort of parenting is that sometimes the best thing to do is to ask for help. And that's something he does quite naturally on the outside. When he steps outside the fellowship, he's quite happy and willing to sort of say, I need help. And that's where those new connections form and new friendships too. So
absolutely. Yeah. So I'm joined in conversation with Samuel Burr, debut novel, Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. So I'm thinking about Clayton, right? When he steps outside, he's, grown up, what did you say? Like old before his time, But I think, he's kind of raised by, Pippa and Earl, kind of primarily, but then the ancillary characters that are part of this fellowship also impart their knowledge on him as well. And I think one of the most striking scenes in the book that speaks to how well he was raised is when he's, on this quest, following clues from Pippa, and he comes across this lovely lady sitting on a bench. And you want to talk a little bit about Scylla?
Yeah. I'm going to try and do it without getting emotional, but essentially, the lady that Scylla, the character called Scylla in the book, who is a lady that he sort of stumbles upon basically in a London park. She's sat on a bench, and I think he's on his way to go and meet someone quite significant, and he's very nervous about that. And he decides to take a moment, and he goes to a park, and naturally Clayton, as a young man, sees the older person and goes and sits with them on the bench. And I think there's a moment where this character Scylla, an older lady, is, and this is a sort of a sad thing really, but I think it's probably true, if a young man just suddenly decided to come and sit next to you on a bench when there are other benches available, she's a little bit alarmed and she gets up to leave, and he encourages her to stay, and they end up having a conversation. And he realizes that actually the bench that she's sitting on is a memorial bench for her husband that sadly passed away, and it's a place that she comes every day. It's a place where they used to have lunch together, and she brings her packed lunch and she sits and has a lunch in the same park every day. So that character was inspired by a lady who I've met about 4 years ago now. During COVID, I became a volunteer with an elderly charity. And I think it was around that time that obviously the loneliness epidemic had been talked about for quite a while, but obviously we were all sort of experiencing loneliness in various forms. We were all isolated. Absolutely. And I remember thinking, how lucky am I, to live with someone else? I've got someone I can talk to. It was tough for me. And I remember thinking, how hard would this be for people who live alone and people who don't have family to call on? So I signed up for this. It was Telephone Friendships was the name of this volunteering. And essentially I became a coordinator. So I would pair up, it's like a matchmaker. I would pair up young people and old people with similar interests. And they would have a weekly telephone call. And through that process, I met a lady called Pauline, and Pauline was, definitely the most sort of isolated person I've ever met. I remember when I spoke to her the first time, she said she hadn't spoken to anyone in, I think, probably like 10 days or something. Ooh. And you kind of think, what does that do to someone? Someone that's bright and with it, and is really, one of the things she said to me once, which really moved me, was, just because I'm old doesn't mean I don't love, meeting new people. People assume that when you're old, you're just fine being on your own. I'm an extrovert. I've always been an extrovert, and I love meeting new people. So this telephone thing was a lifeline for her. And every person that spoke to her fell in love, and she could hold a great conversation. She had great stories. And I sort of became friends with her, and I've remained friends with her over 4 years. So I've been talking to her at least once a week. I spoke to her early on tonight, in fact. I told her I was doing this, and she's very excited. What I did with her is I sort of spoke to her a little bit about her experiences and how it feels to be someone living alone in a big city full of millions of people and feeling completely isolated. Yeah. And I use sort of the notion of what we discussed during those conversations to inform that character, and to sort of give my telephone friend Pauline a voice in a sort of unusual way, to sort of allow her to sort of say what it feels like to be in that position. It was something I was really, really passionate about. And I'm really proud of that, actually, in the book. It's one of my favorite moments is that. And what I was really keen to show was, the fellowship, in a way, the community that Clayton leaves behind is a kind of, it's not a dream world, but it's almost, it almost is. And I wanted to show the flip side. I wanted to show the reality for what it's like for most people, and actually to sort of use that as a way to make people think, why does it have to be like this? Like, why are so many millions of older people forgotten about? How do they fall through the cracks? Why is it that people can go 10 days without speaking to another human being? It's kind of scary and crazy. And also, what's really scary and really crazy, particularly for Clayton, is that could happen to him. There's a moment where she says something like, "Oh, don't you worry, you've got your whole life ahead of you." But what's interesting about Clayton, his predicament, is that his world is disappearing fast. His world, the friends, his family are all old, and they're slowly passing away. And I think when Pippa passes away, that definitely feels like a wake-up call for him, where he thinks, what happens next? What happens when I'm on my own? So and I hope that Scylla and Clayton as characters both learn something from each other during that interview.
Absolutely. And I think readers, hopefully will take that lesson away as well. When you see somebody, just a simple hello, how are you type of thing, wherever you are waiting in line, or as you all would say, the queue. So there's that. And I also think Pippa alludes to it earlier at one point in the book, that she's like, just because I'm old, like people stop looking and engaging with us. And so she's also at the same time struggling, her arc, when we look back into her from her heyday moving forward, is she talks a little bit about, she always thought success equated with fitting in versus standing out. She goes so far as to have like a pen name for writing the crosswords, which is Squire. So people just assume she's a guy and are kind of blown away that, this fabulous, fantastic, feisty woman is actually the one that's created like an epic number of crossword puzzles over the course of her career.
Yeah.
So
it was, so there was a documentary that I saw on the BBC. I think it was called something like The Secret Life of Crosswords. And there was a real crossword compiler. I should stress she wasn't the inspiration for Pippa, but there was something about this lady. I think her name was Ruth Crisp, which was a great name. But Ruth Crisp was a sort of woman in a man's world. She was a woman who had defied the odds and become the sort of top compiler in the country. And she was, sort of feared within the community because she was so good at it. And I loved her story. And I think, I knew quite early on that there's something about that particular era of broadsheet press and the world that they were inhabiting. I like the idea of having a strong female woman that was going to be defying the odds and forging her own path and her own career through sort of her own determination. But actually it's that determination that comes back to bite her later on. But we all love Pippa. I think we should all be a little bit more Pippa in life. I
know. I'm like channeling my inner Pippa is what I'm thinking. There are moments where I'm like, whew, and then I was like, no, what would Pippa do? Right. So absolutely. So I'm joined in conversation with Samuel Burr. His debut novel just released on Tuesday, Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. So the other character that plays a really important role in Clayton's life is Earl. And there's like a description, that you mentioned in the book that, it's important to have somebody in your life who can nudge you out of your comfort zone. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Earl and Clayton?
Well, it's a really close relationship. He's sort of the closest father figure, I guess, that Clayton has. Earl has a very interesting relationship with Pippa too, that we see unfold. And I think what I wanted to do with Earl was and with the sort of the romance that unfolds quite quickly in the opening chapters, is to have a sort of unconventional romance story. So in the opening scenes, we discover that Earl is married, and although Pippa sort of pines for him and he's this very handsome maze maker, she knows that he's off limits. And then very sadly, his wife becomes ill. So what I wanted to try and do as sort of in terms of the metaphor of the maze maker, I like the idea that this is a man whose life has taken him in all sorts of different directions. And there's a moment in the book where Earl sort of reflects on that and says, that's what, life isn't a maze. Like there's not one correct path to the final solution. We're all just, we've all just got to make the decisions and make the turnings that feel right in the moment, whether that's turning left, right, or backwards. And so that's reflected in the relationship that unfolds with him and Pippa throughout the book. I've left it quite open towards the end, so it's up to interpretation. But I love the idea that he was. What I really, really wanted to do is to establish the fact that Clayton, as a young boy and as a young man, actually was always loved. And he was never, although he was abandoned at birth, which obviously is horrifying, he feels lucky that he has been raised the way that he has. And he's had so many wonderful people to help sort of learn from. There's a line from Earl that actually is something like, there's 1,000 years between us all.
Yes.
Reflecting on the idea that all these people together have got so much wisdom and life knowledge to sort of pass on. And Clayton's quite grateful for that, actually. He's sort of conscious that that's a unique position to be in. And his relationship with Earl is very sweet, because Earl, in the very first couple of chapters, Earl is getting lost in his own maze, which is a very sad moment. The sort of maze maker can't remember his own route, and Clayton sort of takes him by the arm and leads the way. So yeah, that's a huge sort of a thing that becomes very prominent in the book. Yeah, I love Earl. I love he's very handsome.
Yes. I know, it's kind of like I had a crush on Earl as I was reading the book. The other thing I'm just struck by is the lessons we learn from each other, right? You know, intergenerational, right? Like they're learning, the fellowship is learning as much from Clayton as Clayton is for them. There's always this interesting exchange of, you know, life experience versus, you know, new adventure, right? Yeah. And you capture that and the nuances so beautifully throughout this book. About, you know, asking for help, about what is the other line? It's not about the solution, it's about solving.
Yeah.
You know, that
not in the solution. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's life, right? I mean, they talk about, you know, not just focusing on the destination, but the journey that got you there. Yeah. Right. And so many times we get so caught up in like having to achieve and reaching that particular point or pinnacle or mountain, whatever it looks like. And then we forget, like, there were so many incredible things that happened along the way, and people that we've met and experiences we've had, and to kind of try to, you know, stay in that present moment.
Yeah. And I'm glad that one of the things I was really conscious of, so when I talk to people about my volunteering, normally their first reaction is, oh, that's so lovely of you. You know, how sweet. And actually, I want to say, well, no, actually, I love it. Like I gain as much from, I think those interactions only really work, and they would only work over a sustained period of time, as they have in my case for 4 years, if both parties are gaining from that exchange. And I like to think, obviously, as much as my telephone friend is gaining from my sort of companionship and the phone calls, regular phone calls, I'm gaining just as much as well, because, you know, her insight and her the things that she's sort of passing on to me. There was a great moment a few weeks ago where I was sort of complaining about, I was sort of saying how busy I was during the week, and how much I was just looking forward to having a weekend where I just put my pajamas on, just read books, and just, you know, had a really cozy weekend. And she was horrified. My telephone friend could not believe that I lived in London and that I was going to just stay in all weekend. She said, go out. She said, go to a party, get drunk. Yeah. Because that's exactly what she can't do. And it was actually a really good wake-up call. It was like, do you know what? Actually, yeah, I shouldn't just stay in all weekend. I should probably go out and do something.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. So I'm joining conversation with Samuel Burr, debut novel, The Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. Thinking about that exchange, it also, I think, works in medicine, right? You have these young residents who are coming out of medical school, right, with this new knowledge. Yeah. And then you have like the physicians they're working with that have been in practice for 20 years. So have like firsthand hands-on experience in this interesting dialogue that they exchange, where they're learning from each other. Oh, maybe if I approach it this way. Oh, but yet I've had, you know, I don't know how many millions of cases that this is what it's been like. So, yeah, I think it comes down to having an open mind, right? And, you know, my dad always says you can learn a lot even from a bad example. So I don't rule those dynamics out either, right?
Yeah, and not making judgments. I think actually, even the exchange that Clayton has with the lady he meets on the bench, the older lady Scylla, she sort of actually is a little bit alarmed by a young person come sit next to her, and actually that's probably quite normal. And I wanted to sort of capture that. I wanted there to be. I guess one of the things you're always doing as a writer is you're always trying to provoke and make readers sort of question things or think about things. And actually, there's no reason why a young person and an old person can't sit together on a park bench and talk. You know, it's not weird. Why does that have to be weird? No. And it's sad that she felt threatened, and that's probably just, you know, the fact of life. But it's a good thing to sometimes stop and question things and think, why is that something that feels weird to us? It shouldn't do.
Yeah. And maybe that should be our cue. If something kind of makes us uncomfortable or kind of feels weird, maybe we stop and think about why, and should it be, right?
Yeah.
And what do we do to kind of help make it not so weird anymore?
Exactly. Yeah.
So your outreach, you know, that happened during COVID, and then coordinating all that. I mean, that's spectacular. So the other thing is, there's puzzles, and I'm going to try to hold up a page, but throughout the chapters, right, you see, like, it's hard, I don't know if they can, but there's puzzles throughout the book, right? And so I tried really hard, because anagrams play a role in the book,
Yeah.
right? And I tried so hard to do something with your name. And
Oh,
all
really?
I could come up with is Burma rules. That's all I have.
There's much worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I had an awful lot of fun. It was one of the things that was probably the most challenging. I remember getting halfway through and thinking, this is my first book. Why am I making this so hard? Because essentially what I like the idea of is having puzzles infused within the prose that help unlock different parts of the story. And that, to begin with, was a great idea. And then the reality of actually doing it and editing the book with all those puzzles and doing the typesetting. I didn't do the typesetting, but the challenges it threw up was quite remarkable. I'm really pleased with the puzzles that ultimately have ended up in the book. One of the things that was always a bit of a challenge was thinking about level of difficulty. One thing, I don't know if you find this, Jen, but if a puzzle's too difficult, it annoys me. I get cross.
Yeah. Well, that's normally like the Thursday crosswords for me. I'm good Monday, I'm good Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm like, nah. By Thursday, I'm like, yeah, forget it.
Yeah. And there was a really interesting decision I had to make where when Pippa passes away, she, as I said, bequeaths this final puzzle to Clayton, and it takes the form of a crossword. Now, interestingly, during the research, I hadn't realized that America, you don't do cryptic crosswords, do you? Cryptic crosswords in the UK are their next level. So I spent months and months trying to get my head around how to compile those sort of crosswords. And I was very lucky to get an American book deal at the same time as the UK deal. And so I was working in tandem with the two editors, and it became quite apparent that actually I was going to need a different crossword grid for the American manuscripts than I was in the UK.
Yeah.
Because it just wouldn't make any sense at all, because it is very, very complicated. But actually there was a moment where my American editor said to me, what would Pippa do? Like, just go by the characters. And actually what Pippa would have done is what I love about Clayton is that he's the sort of everyman.
Yes.
He's sort of me in the mix. He's someone who likes puzzles, and he is someone who I would describe myself as a sort of enthusiastic amateur, but he's not that confident. And so what Pippa wouldn't, of course, set him a puzzle that she knew he couldn't solve. The line in the very first chapter, when Clayton is standing at the coffin and Pippa's lying there, he takes out that day's crossword from the newspaper he'd sort of taken out the paper, and he folds it up and he puts it in the coffin. And there's a line where he says, it's a cryptic crossword from the Times, Sunday Times in the UK. He's never been able to solve a cryptic crossword in his life. It's not something he's ever been able to share with anyone, but that's not something he's ever been able to do. And so, of course, Pippa knows that, and she's not going to give him a puzzle he's not going to be able to solve. So that sort of luckily solved two problems. It meant it felt right for the characters, but also it meant I didn't have to create two separate crossword grids for two manuscripts. I think would have been a nightmare. But it was good fun, and I just like the idea of having a book that you can read and you can play, having an interactive element that sort of makes it feel just a bit unique and a bit different.
Yeah, I felt, so I'm joined in conversation with Samuel Burr, writer of Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. I felt like I was in Clayton's shoes, because I was seeing what he was seeing with those puzzles and trying to figure out, as I'm reading and I'm looking at the puzzle, there's this, you're right in that character's shoes. So I think it's a great gesture. And then, you think about Pippa, and like, she's not going to set him up to fail, but she's not going to make it super easy either. Yeah. Right. So a lot of the lessons that she's learned in her life can be imparted as he's on this adventure.
Exactly. And again, it's sort of one of the ways he's able to solve the puzzle is by getting support and help from other people. She's quite deliberate in the way that she's planted the various puzzles. There's sort of a trail of clues to solve, and she's done it in a very deliberate way. So the people that he meets en route are well skilled and well versed to help him.
And then you've also captured that moment I think we've all done with, we're working on something and it just becomes really, really difficult. And so like you walk away from it, right? So he talks about, like, before he goes to sleep, he kind of thinks about that clue and then just allows his mind when he's sleeping to try to process it. And I think we've all been there. We've been like, I don't understand this. We walk away, set it aside for the evening, come back, and you're like, oh my God, how did I not get this? Right.
Exactly.
So there's something cool about the subconscious that, you know, is kind of always working, even though it doesn't feel like it is.
Exactly. And also, I love the idea of that when that scene's happening, I'm sort of also allowing the reader to reflect a bit and try and catch up too. I like the idea that, like you say, that you're seeing the world through his eyes and that you're you're on a similar par in terms of the solving. I like the idea that the reader can play along and isn't getting solutions too early or too late.
Yeah. Can you talk about, I don't think we're spoiling it if we talk about the meet cute.
Yes. There's a lovely, there's a lovely moment where Clayton meets someone on the outside who he becomes very interested in, surprisingly. And I was really keen to write a story that had a same-sex relationship in it without having sort of rainbow flags all over my book. As much as I want to fly the flag, I really want my book to be a book for everyone. And I think what I was really proud of is how publishers all over the world actually have taken that part of the novel and it's not become an issue. At no point has anyone ever said that that's ever going to, limit the number of readers I'm going to have or put people off. It's very, very innocent and it's very gentle. And that, and I wanted to write. I don't know if do you get Heartstopper on Netflix in America?
I don't know, but I'm gonna look it up now.
It's a UK. It's a huge hit on Netflix here, and it's based on a series of graphic novels. But it became very, very, very popular, and I was so enamored by it. I sort of was watching it when I was editing the book, but I was really fascinated in a series that took off in such a big way that essentially leads to a single kiss. It was so gentle all the way through, and that was what I was looking to do. I wanted to make something that also reflected who Clayton was. And I think sometimes, if I'm honest, as a young gay man, I can sometimes struggle to identify with the community or feel like I don't fit in sometimes, just because, like any community, it can feel sometimes that you have to behave a certain way or dress a certain way or look a certain way. There's lots of pressures that come with that. And I like the idea that Clayton's a bit different, and that's fine. And there's lots of different ways to be how you are. So him and another person called Neil, they find each other on the outside and go on their own little journey too. So that was nice.
Yeah. With that, you end up talking, my gosh, the docent at the museum starts talking about the Greeks and how they have 6 different words for love.
Yes.
So I found that really kind of interesting as well. I mean, it's kind of like you hear they have so many different words for snowflakes, but it perfectly captures the different loves that we have, right, in our life, and people love and want to be loved. And Pippa talks about it. That was her big thing, as life, and love being one of the greatest mysteries.
Yeah. And I think that's what the fellowship was sort of built on, both as a place and also as a book. I wanted to write a book that was also about love. It was about friendship. It was about community. It was about romantic love. Sometimes it was about, companionship. And I love the idea that, love does take very many different forms, and being able to identify that and navigate the world with all the complexities in it, I think is one of the biggest puzzles of all, really.
Yeah, I love them as a couple, Clayton and Neil, and a houseboat, hoping, that it works. It's just, characters are just so important. And one of the things that you do so beautifully in the book is capture the complexities essentially of being human, right? We're not all good. We're not all bad. We're not all frenetic in terms of adventure. We're not all cautious and homebodies. Like there's like this interesting blend, and you've captured that so well in these characters. I think that's what makes them so relatable. You know, I think we can all think of somebody like Pippa that we have that, you know, is perhaps that great aunt who always had, you know, wisdom to share, you know.
Yeah,
So,
and also like there's a friendship she develops with another lady called Nancy, who's a
mhm.
cab driver who she sort of stumbles upon one day. And on the surface, they are very, very different, but
Mhm.
they are both sort of women operating in men's worlds. There's a, you know, as a cab driver, she's unusual. She's a woman in the 80s, and Pippa likewise. And they sort of develop this kinship and friendship that, changes both of their lives actually in different ways.
Yeah.
I'm very fond of Nancy too. She was a great fun character
I mean, I think that's amazing that in 356 pages, you've captured what is an enormous cast of characters, but done it so well that I feel like I know each one of them. I understand Hector. I understand Earl. I like Nancy. Scylla's super sweet. Neil. I mean, it's a testament to your writing and your ability to do that. So that these are people that I was like, well, shoot, now I want a fellowship. I don't know what it would be of, maybe fellowship of book readers. I don't know, but
I had
that
someone
sense of camaraderie,
I
you
had
know?
someone write me yesterday and say, is there a real place like this, please? And I have to
Yeah,
say, I'm really sorry, it doesn't exist.
no,
But yeah, I'd be signing up. My God, if I could. I mean, I'm not clever enough to be a puzzle maker, but yeah, I love the idea of living together with lots of very different people under one roof. And even if the house is a bit crumbly and a bit dusty,
yeah.
all the
Oh,
more.
that just adds to the charm, right? Yeah, absolutely. Kind of reminds me a little bit of college, right? You know, when you're in the dorms and you have all these, you know, people from all different backgrounds and, you know, all different parts of the country. And yet, you know, we all come together and, you know, kind of just spend lots of time with one another, you know, doing just normal everyday things. It's not always, you know, a trip to the museum or, you know, that type of thing. So let's see what else I can ask you.
Obsessed with all your tabs that you've got on your
Oh
book.
yeah, Mike will make fun of me once we hang up,
I
but
really want to
it's
see what you've
just,
highlighted. It's mad.
well, if you would have seen me in December when I was reading to moderate that panel, and it was an e-galley. So my phone is full of like pictures of stuff that I want to be able to talk about so much easier
Yeah.
with like the analog
Yeah.
version. And then I just go back and you like look at it, and it's just fun. You know, to see what struck
Yeah.
me while I was reading. So people will always want to know what you're currently working on.
So I am very lucky that I got a 2-book deal in the UK. I'm working on a second book. It's not a follow-up to the
Okay.
Puzzlemakers. It's a sort of standalone story about a very different world. I think what's really interesting is when you finish writing a book, I sort of took stock a bit and sort of allowed myself to have a bit of time to think about what it was that, number one, I enjoyed doing,
Mhm.
what I felt I was good at, what I want to improve. I sort of made a list of all the things for the second book. And one of the things I'm interested in, and what I did with this book, was to sort of try and tell a big story in a very small world. So what I mean by that is I love exploring very niche communities, very specific worlds that feel potentially niche and potentially might be a bit off-putting, but actually doing it in a way that kind of feels universal, finding the narrative within it that could, you know, relate to almost anyone.
Mhm.
And for this, the Puzzlemakers, it was about people finding their place in the world and finding the missing piece, finding what they're sort of lacking in life. And so with the second book, I'm doing something similar. I'm really excited about it, but it's still very early days, so I can't say too much. But
So that at least we have something to look forward to from you.
yes.
That's the important takeaway.
Yeah, my editor's looking forward to, my UK editor's looking forward to very much.
Yeah.
Well,
Awesome. So yeah, I'm joined in conversation with Samuel Burr, debut novel, just 2 days old here in the States, The Fellowship of Puzzlemakers. So We're going to go to the final 5 questions.
Okay.
Neil organizes his books by color. How do you organize your books at home?
I can't even go. It's so bad. If I could turn this laptop around and you could see what's behind, this is like, actually, I can't show you because I've got probably 100 books under my desk, piled up against the wall.
Okay.
And they're all books for my second book. They're all reference books. They're all things that I'm interested in and I keep flicking to. So I've got literally 100 books on the floor. I've got a stack there, a stack there. I've once had a storage unit full of books that I've now been able to move to my
person. I finally found my people, right?
It's so bad. I'm nothing like Neil. I do not organize things at all in any shape or form. I'm supposed to say. I wish I did. I wish my partner wishes I did too. Jesus God.
So working in the television and film industry, what is your favorite TV show or movie?
Oh, there's a film, I was talking about it earlier today. There's a film, probably 10 years old now, documentary, I'm sure you can get in America. It's called Young at Heart. It was a feature-length documentary that was released on Channel 4 in the UK, but was also theatrically released in cinemas. And it was a film about an American group of older people, all in their sort of 70s and 80s, that traveled across America singing rock songs. They're in a sort of rock chorus. And it was truly definitely one of the most inspiring films I've seen, both in terms of the content and sort of the themes, but also the style of it and everything really inspired so much of what I've gone on to do in TV. I love the sort of heartwarming nature of it, and it's really, really moving without giving away too much. There's some really devastating scenes in it too, so do check it out. The Young at Heart.
Young at Heart. Okay.
Genuinely will move you to tears.
Yeah. Are you able to suspend your like television movie brain and just enjoy a film, or does that kind of always play in the background? Like, oh wow, I wouldn't have led with that camera angle, or oh that lighting. You know, can you?
At the minute, I'm fine because I haven't worked in TV for a little while because I've been so busy with the book. But I also worked in unscripted. So if anything that's scripted, I can it feels like a completely different thing. I'm actually fine with, and what I'm struggling with now which is a real issue, is with books. I'm sort of looking at all books and thinking, comparing it to my own work or thinking how that relates to my own story. And I'm sort of comparing everything that I'm writing for my second book at the minute with a published book, which is never a useful thing to do. But yeah. It's a battle. Yeah.
So would you ever appear on a quiz show, and which one?
Oh, I would, but you probably wouldn't know them. The ones in the UK. So we have a thing on Monday nights on the BBC, which is the most British thing. So we have it's called University Challenge. That's the classic British quiz show. It is insanely difficult. It's some of the smartest people from all the top universities in the country go head to head. It's very sort of boring, really. It's 2 panels and it's just questions back and forth, but unbelievably difficult. There's another thing called Only Connect, which goes on immediately afterwards. Only Connect is slightly funnier, slightly more tongue-in-cheek. It's about finding unusual and very obscure connections between things. And then after that, there's another program called Mastermind. So Monday nights on the BBC is like quiz night, and it's become a bit of a thing. And I was sort of fascinated in that, working in television, seeing the appeal that those shows had. And not just one show, but actually people were happy to spend all night watching 3 back-to-back different quiz shows, really betting into it. And Tom, my partner, who is exceptionally bright. No, I tell you what, I wouldn't go on a quiz show, but I'd send Tom, my partner. Send him on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire so we could win a bit of money.
Yeah, that would be great. Because, but you know, rest assured, because everybody's going to go out and buy your book, right? After listening to this. Here's an item. Which item would you lock up in a vault?
Oh, I've got it here actually, conveniently, and I didn't know you were going to ask this. It would be my hardback proof that I only have 1 copy of. And this is the UK version, but it
is so unusual to get a hardback proof of a book.
It's the only one that I have, and I literally have it wrapped in bubble wrap, and I have it stored under my bed. I would like to have that stashed away somewhere very secure because I don't want to damage it. It's very precious.
And it has gold writing on it, which is like super cool. Okay, Final question. So Pippa's friend Nancy has a ton of Danielle Steele novels, right? And so now Pippa has them on her shelf. What book would people be surprised to find on your bookshelf?
Oh, interesting. What would they be surprised to find? I think there's probably not that many. I mean, they probably wouldn't be surprised to find this, but I've got a book about the sort of biology of cats. I love cats. Obviously, they form a part of the book.
Absolutely.
But I've got a very scientific book that I'm sort of just started reading, and it's nothing like I would normally read. But because I'm obsessed with cats, it's got pride of place on my bookshelf.
Awesome. So I want to take a moment and just thank all of you this evening, afternoon, who are watching and listening. I want to thank Penguin Random House, Michael and Kayla, for making this possible. I want to thank our tech team, for making sure everything ran smoothly, to MaxBax Books for making sure that they have copies of Samuel's books for us. And then finally, a huge thank you to you, Samuel Burr, on your debut novel. I am looking forward to reading more stories from you. I'm Jen Jumba with Writers Unplugged. Thank you and happy reading.
Thank you.